Welcome to our journey of transformation. We saw last time that loving God with all of our hearts means that we leave behind that part of our hearts that was dedicated to selfishness, and now surrender our hearts wholly and completely to our Heavenly Father with one desire only, and that is to live a transformed life in His image, to love as He loves. But that's just the beginning, because we soon find out that the challenge to live a transformed life is far deeper than we thought. And as we uncover more layers of selfishness, we understand that loving God has to come from something much more deeper within us. For that reason, we're going to begin now the second stage of our journey of transformation, loving God with all of our souls. And this study now will be called Love That Is From Spirit to Spirit. First of all, let's understand what the word soul refers to. The word soul is translated from the Greek word psyche that was used in the first century and had many different meanings, depending on the context. For instance, it could refer to just simply the breath of life. If you had a soul, it meant that you were breathing. It was used that way in Acts chapter 20, verse 20. But the word soul could also be used to refer to our deepest emotions and feelings, our desires. And in that way, sometimes it was a synonym for heart. It's used in that way in Colossians 3, verse 23. At the same time, psyche or soul could also refer to our thoughts, our will, our purposes, our mentality. And in some passages, it was in fact a synonym for mind. It's used that way in Acts chapter 4, verse 32. But at the same time, the word soul could refer to the being that we are, apart from the body, that has the capacity to live on after death, that has a level of existence different from our bodies, dimensions of existence that are outside of the time and space that we are so familiar with. And in this sense, it is also a synonym for spirit. Paul distinguishes the soul or the spirit from the body in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, when he says that our body is like a tent that we live in, and the we that lives in the tent is the spirit or the soul. That's our identity and carries the qualities of the real person that we are. And so, in the invitation that Jesus gives us to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, the word soul in this invitation is not a synonym, of course, for heart, because heart is mentioned specifically, nor is it a synonym for mind, because mind is mentioned specifically. It instead refers to that part of our being that is our essence, apart from the body, the deepest part of who we are, that continues on after the body dies. And in this way, it's a synonym of spirit. The word soul and the word spirit are interchangeable in the New Testament in this sense. In this lesson and in the following lessons, we're going to be using the word spirit more than the word soul, because the word spirit helps us understand our connection with God, whom we'll find out, too, is spirit. And so, loving God with all of our soul, or our spirit, means that this love for God must come from something very deep within us. And let's think about for a moment again what it means to love God. Love, as we've used it in our studies, describes, first of all, an emotion of respect and appreciation for the value of another being. And this emotion of appreciation or respect moves us to action, to care for that being in some way. With respect to the Father, we love Him, appreciate and respect Him for who He is. And we want to be like Him, love like He loves, love what He loves, love who He loves. And in this way, loving God translates into loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, living in love. But with respect to our relationship with God, we reserve a very special degree of love that we call worship. Worship expresses our belief that He alone is worthy of the respect and appreciation that comes to the Creator, the one who is the highest, the all-powerful, who has never had a beginning or an ending, who is the beginning of everything, who is the origin of love, the origin of light. And so God is love. He is love. That's his essence. But we also find out that God is spirit. A belief that's very unique in Christianity and its antecedents in the faith of Israel for thousands of years was that we ought not to make any images of God, any graven images, any statues that represent God's appearance or characteristics. And you never find images of Israelite gods within the archaeological ruins of ancient cultures. They didn't create images. When they did attempt from time to time borrow some images from their neighbors, they fell into serious problems with God because of that, because God is spirit. This is what Jesus taught. In John chapter 4, John tells us about the conversation Jesus had with the Samaritan woman. And in that conversation, he says to the Samaritan woman, Jesus does, that God is spirit. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean that he's just a puff of air. It's language that's a way of describing his existence on a different level in different dimensions. In different dimensions that are distinct from the concepts we have of space and time. But also describes the fact that he's a being and not a thing. And we can't be so arrogant as to think that the only dimensions that exist are the ones that we can sense ourselves, because even physicists believe that the universe is multi-dimensional, maybe even 11 different dimensions. But to say that God is love, as well as saying that he is spirit, means that he's being. He's a spirit capable of emotions and motivations. And of course, if God is a creator, he must be capable of emotions and motivations and will and purpose and the ability to make decisions to be able to create and design the universe. And so these are qualities only of being. He's not a thing. And therefore we can say that if God is love, and he is also spirit, a being, then love is a quality of spirit. And this is something very impactful about this thought, that love is a quality of our spirits. Consider for a moment our ability to love unconditionally. If we were only bodies, and not spirits or souls, then love would only be the result of electrical, chemical reactions in our brains that make up the connections between the billions of neurons that compose our brains. And if we were to say to somebody, I love you, it would only be the result of these chemical reactions. And what would love really be then? Would it be any different than saying we love math? It would be the result of the same kinds of electrical, chemical reactions that make connections between neurons in our brains. And would it make love any different than hate? Because they're both the results of the same kinds of electrical, chemical reactions. And so there is something that we call love that must be very different from this. And of course, there are some reactions that we call love that really are just the response of electrical chemical reactions in the brain. For instance, when a newly born baby smiles in response to the mother's smile, the mother may think that the baby is telling the mother, I love you. But the baby is imitating the smile of the mother. In fact, the baby's brain that is still developing has neurons that are called mirror neurons that record and imitate the actions or the facial expressions of the mother. And so that's what the baby's doing, is mirroring the reaction of the mother or the smile of the mother. Or if somebody enters a room and we suddenly feel attraction to that person, we can't say that that attraction is love. It's process of, in the moment, it's the result of chemical electrical processes in our brain, reacting in some way for some reason. But then there is something essentially different about loving unconditionally. Because we know from experience that loving unconditionally is a result of serious contemplation, meditation, and difficult decision, especially when we love our enemies. Because when we love our enemies, we're not responding or mirroring their behavior. We're contemplating what to do and how to react. And in that sense, love is a quality of our spirits, because we already know that we must be more than bodies, because we can think about our thinking. And in fact, think about the structure of our thoughts and change the structure of our thinking. And whatever does that has to be outside of the brain itself, because it's exerting control over the processes of the brain. When we train our minds to think differently than we've been thinking, and we stop our minds from thinking one thing and decide to think something else, and in fact change the structure of our thinking through training our minds to think differently, there is something that is exercising control and power over those connections between neurons. And it cannot be the brain itself. It has to be something outside of the brain, and the only thing possible would be the spirit, our soul. And love then, unconditional love, the process of conscious decision-making, is a quality of our spirits. And in fact, this allows us to have connection or relationship with the Creator, because we essentially are spirit souls, and He is spirit. And when we love as He loves, we're able to make connection, have relationship with Him. That's the aspect of our existence that is able to relate to Him. And for that reason, John says in 1 John chapter 4 that God is love, and those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. It's the point of connection when we love unconditionally. Now let's take a look a little bit more closely at the conversation that Jesus had with a woman of Samaria in John chapter 4. Jesus had arrived to the town of Sychar in Samaria for a reason. There was somebody there, a woman of great faith, who had a question, and he wanted to answer that question for her. She didn't know him yet. He waited for her outside of town at a well, and when she came to draw water, she met Jesus. They began to talk, and through their conversation, she realized that he was at least a prophet. And when she realized he was a prophet, she asked him a question that had always troubled her. That was, where to worship God at. Because the Samaritans believed they ought to worship God on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, while the Jews, their rivals, Jesus was a Jew, believed in worshiping Mount Zion in Jerusalem at the temple. Her question was, which is the correct place? She honestly wanted to know, and she honestly felt separated from God for not knowing. She didn't know, and she didn't have confidence enough to come close to God because she didn't know which was the right mountain. And Jesus surprised her by explaining to her that the place doesn't matter. The time is coming when the place is not going to matter anymore. Here's what happened in the conversation. Let's read from John chapter 4, beginning with verse 19. Here's where the lady asked Jesus the question. "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is of the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth. Worship in spirit and in truth. She was already aware of the importance of worshiping God in truth, because to her, truth meant in the right place, on the right mountain. She just didn't know which one was the true one. But she understood that one ought to worship in truth. But what Jesus emphasized to her was that we ought to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And this was the new part to her. Worship takes place in one's spirit. That's the new place. And the time was coming when the true worshipers would worship God in truth and in spirit. But what was this time that was coming? Well, soon after this conversation, sometime later, Jesus would die on a cross and be resurrected. And then believers would be born again. And upon being born again, God's Spirit would begin to live in them. And in their spirit, worship would take place between their spirit and God's Spirit. The place of worship now is in our spirits, not in a physical place. The Christians in the first century, of course, met together and worshiped God together, but the place was not important. It didn't matter whether they met at a temple or a house someplace. What was important was that they worshiped Him in spirit, with their spirits. It was not just a physical action, a physical ceremony, or a rite or a ritual. What was important was what they felt in their spirits towards God, that they felt this appreciation and respect for Him. Now remember, worship is a manifestation of love. To worship in spirit and in truth means to love in spirit and in truth. To love in truth means to love God for who He is. And to love Him in spirit means that our love for Him must come from something very deep within us, from our spirits, happen in our spirits. And so, now that our journey goes on from loving God with all of our hearts to loving Him with all of our souls, with all of our spirits, we're going to have to pay more attention now to the needs and the weaknesses of our souls, our spirits. And this will be the topic for our next study. So may God bless you.